Hello and welcome to the Sprint 41 review. The sprint was 1 day shorter because of Memorial Day weekend here in the US, but we managed to get quite a lot of things done. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll give an overview of the sprint and the stats. Bronagh will give us an update on the providers. Gregg will give us an update on the platform stuff. Alberto will update us on the REST API. Gregg will tell us about Automate. Harpreet will give us an update on the UI. Rich on SmartState, and Dennis on performance. Next slide, please. All right, so even though this is 1 day shorter, we still got 312 pull requests merged. And I was actually a bunch more merged yesterday morning at the start of Sprint 42. That would probably have been merged normally on Monday. So the mix was pretty good. We had over half were bug fixes, only 39, so about 12% or so were enhancements, and the rest sprinkled with tech debt and refactoring and some other categories. Next slide. The breakdown is also pretty common. The UI got 130, providers got 98, core got 52, and sprinkling of everything else everywhere. On the provider side, containers was leading the pack there. Then we had a number of PRs on Azure, OpenStack, and Hawkular, which is the new provider that was just started recently. That hopefully will make it into the e-release. Next slide, please. So this one I think compares to Sprint 33 from the C release. So as you guys see there was a big drop off from Sprint 32 to 33 last time, and we didn't really experience that drop off this time. So kudos to everyone for working hard here. The mix, you can see also that it was predominantly bug fixes, and that was kind of the direction of this past sprint. So the enhancements kind of looks pretty tiny in comparison to the bugs, and more tech debt and refactoring there. So it's pretty typical, but I think it's trending in the right direction as well. Next slide, please. For Darga itself, we had, out of that 300 plus number of PRs that were merged, 2/3 or a little bit more got backported to Darga. Of those, 157 were bugs. So Darga is really stabilizing here pretty quickly, and I believe we're on track to hopefully release Darga, make a GA next week at the ManageIQ Summit. Next slide, please. So 311 pull requests were merged in ManageIQ. 40 more were merged elsewhere in the repos that are under the ManageIQ organization. 10 website updates. Azure Armrest got a 5. The self-service UI got 4, and then kind of sprinkling of everywhere else. So really nice all-around showing there. Next slide. Over to Bronagh. Tell us about providers.
Right, so on the provider side, I'm going to share some updates on Azure, containers, Google, OpenStack, and then I'll highlight some core provider changes. Next slide, please. So in Azure, like some of the other cloud providers, a provider will contain resources that belong to a specific geographical location, for example, US, East or West or Northern Europe. But prior to the sprint, it was the location of the resource groups that determined which provider its resources would be placed into. But we learned that a resource, for example, a cloud network, an instance, an IP address, can actually belong to a different region than the resource group it's part of, and this caused failures. So as of this sprint, we now look at the location of the resource itself when gathering inventory for a provider. It was not a significant code change, but it did have a significant impact. Next slide, please. So we also added support for metrics collection in Azure, which is another big step in building out the full management story of Azure support. So you're going to see a screenshot here that illustrates some CPU consumption on an instance. Next slide. So the container integration team added multiple endpoint support in this sprint. Yakov worked closely with Aparna on the core UI team to allow users to add a separate endpoint for the Hawkular metric server used in a Kubernetes deployment. Then Arrays added the UI to show the authentication status for the two endpoints. So really great work from the container integration team. Next slide, please. So we saw some interesting errors coming from the community that ended up pointing to a lack of support for custom flavors. So Adam from the core providers team and Joe from the Google team worked together and quickly turned around a fix. Next slide, please. Then we have a few highlights from the OpenStack integration team. So first off, Sam added support for uploading a file for the SSH key pair that can be used in authentication. Previously, the user would have to copy and paste the file contents into the text area on the page. Next slide, please. Sam also added the UI for adding new volumes during the provisioning process. So this allows users to specify a list of new volumes they want to create and attach to their newly provisioned instance. Next slide. So Sam has been busy. He also added the UI for evacuating VMs. So evacuating VMs in OpenStack allows an administrator to move VMs from one problematic compute node to another compute node. So big thanks to the OpenStack integration team. Next slide. So finally, there were a couple of updates from the core providers team that I'd like to call out. So first, Marcel found a problem in the code that saves the inventory collected from the providers. So with the help from Joe Raffanello, Marcel realized we're carrying around way too much baggage in memory and saving VMs to the database. So by manually dropping some of the data we were caching during the inventory save process, he was able to significantly reduce the amount of memory we used. A really nice improvement there. And then finally, Lattice Lab tracked down a problem related to validating credentials on multiple endpoints. After validation, we would accidentally create an erroneous authentication record in the database to get that cleaned up too. So that's it from the providers team. Over to Gregg T to talk about platform updates.
Okay, on the platform side, we had actually a lot of bug fixes and some enhancements. Some of the highlighted areas where we did a lot of bug fixes are enhancements, replication. There's been ongoing work with expressions and lots of fixes in chargeback as well. We've been pushing forward on authentication side, and then Alberto will talk about REST API. Next slide, please. So on the replication side, I mentioned last sprint demo about the fact that the schemas have to match, they have to be identical between the regional databases and the global database. So Nick has done a ton of work on this sprint for schema consistency checking and also creating a tool to actually fix the column order, because that was also important. That tool was a ton of work. So now we're checking the schema when we configure, and we also check the schema before subscription is enabled. If you remember, subscription is on the global side, so global database would subscribe to a region to get replication updates from the region. So this way, we would know ahead of time. We wouldn't allow the replication to start up if the schemas are not matching, and you could actually have maybe not necessarily errors, but you could actually have some weird results because you might be writing stuff to the wrong columns. And also there were some bug fixes as well on the replication side. With expressions, Tim has continued to push forward converting all the conversion code that writes SQL, building strings to use Errol. So I believe at this point all the operators that we support in expressions are now working through Errol. And also at the same time, Yuri's been looking at adding tests and finding bugs as well and fixing those. And some of those are expressions that are in reports. Some of the built-in reports, actually, that may have had some bugs in them for a long time, he's uncovered. And on the chargeback side, also a ton of work going on there with all the changes that were made for Darga release. There's been a lot of bugs, and everybody's been working together. Libor, the team in Spain, Sergio's team, Tamara, Amari, Alberto, all been just all over that stuff. So a lot of bugs squashed there. Next slide, please. Come on. On the external authentication side, also a lot of work. Joe V did all the, with the help of Smitty as well, to set up the environment for him. Ran through the end-to-end getting IPA authentication over an IPA AD trust environment. So a lot of that work was about setting up getting the environment set up and then doing all the configuration and getting it right and actually getting the authentication to go through. So now we can support username and password and Kerberos single sign-on. And Joe V's been documenting that, the configuration for that, and I believe he's got a PR for it that should be merged in the next couple of days for that. Nice work. And I think that's it. I think I'll turn it over to Alberto for the rest. I know, it's still funny. I'll keep using it until it doesn't work anymore.
So on the REST API side, the one thing we have done is the CLI that we had under GEM CFME client, we got that moved to Tools REST API. Minor enhancement to support the decorators, same as attributes there. Also, the old CFME client, which was started but really never finished, was not being used. So that got removed. So in the future, we'll be providing a real API client, GEM, at some point. But this one is not really being used. So that's it for that. Next slide, please. All right, so there was a RFE to have automation requests being approved and denied, because before you could create them from the API automation request, but you had to go through the UI to do the approval there. So we've added the two new actions, approve and denied, which you can target an individual automation request by ID or target multiple ones, standard signature, the action approve or deny with the reason, and the action results. So that was added this sprint. And that's it. Next slide.
Cool. So for Automate, like everybody else, we're focused on bug fixes and stuff in the sprint, but got a couple of changes in that I wanted to highlight. For the service models under storage, we now have their relationship exposed to the storage clusters, as well as for the OpenStack network manager. We now have those three relationships exposed, cloud subnets, network routers, and public networks, which should be a lowercase p there, but I think the slide uppercased it on me. That last one, OpenStack events. So there's now a new event type that we're capturing, and for the power on event, and then that'll raise the policy event for VM start. Next slide. Okay, and then one of the things we got a new tool in the script in the tools directory, which will help people rebuild provision requests that they can then turn around and use those for REST APIs or even automate calls. And this came out of kind of working with a number of people, initially some guys on the container team that needed to provision stuff through automate, and kind of it's hard to figure out where to start sometimes and what parameters need to be passed. So started to realize that it's easy to do it in the UI and then reverse engineer that and see what you would have passed in from the REST call or automate. So put together a little prototype, a couple people used it, had success with it, and then I gave it to Drew, who really wrapped a nice command line interface around it. So it now can list the last X number of requests, so you can see what's in there, ask it to generate one. It can actually turn around and create the request. So it's great for testing. It's great for just getting kind of the baseline set of parameters, and then you can start to tweak those for your needs. So it's really a tool for people that are kind of just getting into the product maybe and want to figure out how they can start to make these requests from external sources or within Automate. So it's there. It's got a help that is available, which documents all the current parameters, and will enhance it if people find any issues or have enhancements requested against it. I'd like to kind of keep it moving, but we're going to put together a talk article around it as well to document it there. Hopefully people use it and find it useful. That's it. Next slide.
So on the UI side, we had about 130 PRs merged, out of which 91 were bugs, 16 enhancements, and rest of them were mix of technical debt and refactoring. Our team has been focusing on fixing bugs, especially blocker bugs, to make release more stable. But we were able to squeeze in some of the features in UI that I have screenshots for in the slides. Actually, a couple of those have already been covered by providers team. And I also want to thank containers team for their contributions on adding features and fixing container-related bugs. Next slide, please. So as you can see in the Configuration Management Explorer, we added new accordion for Ansible Tower job templates. So this is the list of discovered Ansible Tower job templates. Next slide, please. So on the summary screen for the job template, you can see the surveys and variables information was added, and also a toolbar button was added to be able to create a service dialog using the selected job template. Next slide, please. And then on this slide, I have some of the features that were added by containers team. So first of all, I wanted to point out that the infrastructure and container provider forms were converted to Angular during the sprint. And also Hocular endpoint support was added to containers provider. Hocular endpoints can also be used to collect metrics data. Next slide, please. So in the previous sprint, in the Containers Explorer, in the tree on the left, all the containers were displayed under the All Containers nodes. And some of the containers had the same names, so it was difficult to tell them apart from each other. So in this sprint, what we have done is in the containers tree, we have added containers group nodes and display the containers under each of those. Next slide, please. There was a minor change made to containers chargeback reports. The archived column was added so that deleted projects can be displayed on the report. Next slide, please. And there were also some minor changes made to the UI, like services main tab. It used to be under compute main tab, and it's now moved up to be its own top level menu. There was also support added to OpenStack VMs for evacuation. So the evacuate VMs button is added to the OpenStack VMs. And a logo image on the top left has been changed to be a link to bring user to the start page that they had set in My Settings. And that's all from the UI side. Over to Rich.
Okay, just a second. I need to reshare the presentation. So give me a second.
But we had it. Okay, all reshared?
Okay, you're good.
Okay. All right, on the SmartState side, we have. Right.
There's an echo here.
Yeah, somebody probably needs to go on mute.
Again, Rich?
Okay. Good.
Okay.
All right. On the SmartState side, we had 10 pull requests total this sprint. 6 of them were bugged, 2 of them were test related, and 2 were actually enhancements. Of note, we do have Gluster support has been added. This was actually done by the Rev team, which was a good addition. We've needed to do that for a while. And that was actually delivered in the end of sprint 40, and it just didn't make it on the slides for the last sprint. Also, we have Jerry implemented some performance enhancements for SCVMM, Smart State Analysis, and it seems that those enhancements give us between 60 and 70% performance improvement, which is really good. And that's it for me. Next slide.
Performance has been focused on memory utilization. Thank Joe Raffanello and Jason for diving in for the memory for a couple of days this sprint to help reduce memory usage. A couple of things to note here. Overall, was that the attempt was made to reduce the base size of the workers, which had grown from 5.5 to 5.6. The testing with which Alex has done on 5.6.0.0 to 5.6.0.8. Generic workers has dropped about 75 meg at that point, and probably about 72 meg. The others were not quite as dramatic, and there's still some work to be done there. Bronagh also already mentioned the EMS refresh change. That was found during looking at Amazon Public Images. That was using about 4 gig of memory. Dropped to a little under 1 gig with that change. So that one simple change was a massive help. That's it. Next slide, please.
Next slide, Marianne. Thanks. So that was it on performance?
Yeah.
Over to Alissa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So this milestone, we mostly focused on adding tests. We fixed several bugs in areas like permissions, navigation from screen to screen, adding navigation between relationships of entities, and we had one sortable content, which is optimizing and enhancing of the event flow, where we could whitelist events coming from here, specify the event type, and adding several more fields to the event itself. That's it for me.
Thanks. So with that, that kind of covers the whole sprint. Thanks everyone for all the contributions and all the work. At this point, I'll turn it over to questions. All right, that was pretty. All right, so looking forward to seeing most of you at the ManageIQ Summit next week here in Mahwah, and we'll have the next sprint demo in 3 weeks. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.